get started. Thank you for attending our 2023 annual conference. We're very happy to see you all. My name is Mara Hanley. I'm the AmeriCorps Vista Communications Support Specialist at the Ice Age Trail Alliance, but I'm going to be monitoring this session today. The annual conference is one of our largest events of the year, and we are happy to have so many members and volunteers joining us. We have over 480 people registered, which is very exciting. And it's great to see so many familiar faces, and for me, since this is my first year attending, so many new faces. So we have a few quick announcements before we get started. Thank our sponsors. Our lead sponsor is the West Foundation, and then the Brott Stanley Foundation and Godfrey Kahn. And then in this session, the High Point chapter of the Ice Age Trail Alliance is also a sponsor. So Drew Hanson is the partnerships liaison for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. He's been a member of the Ice Age Trail Alliance since 1990 and was on the Alliance's staff from 1996 to 2002 as geographer, and then 2002 to 2009 as Trailway Director. Drew was a private consultant from 2009 to 2020. He has co-authored the Alliance's first edition of the Ice Age Trail Atlas and co-editor of the Alliance's first edition of the Ice Age Trail Guidebook, Companion Guide, and Along Wisconsin's Ice Age Trail, as well as Wisconsin DNR's 2006 Wisconsin and Legacy Report. So Drew, feel free.
Thank you. Thank you, Mara. It's so fun to be in a room full of people who want to hear about geology and history. And especially fun about that is that I'm not a geologist and I'm not a historian. I'm a geographer, so you get to hear about the introduction to the Ice Age Trail geology and history from a geographer. And I have to plug a few things. There is an event at Southern Kettle Moraine called Wisconsin Out We Go Green on May 13th. I'll leave these out here. There's some on the front table too. That I work now for the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, and that is an event that Ice Age Trail Alliance is helping us with, again, May 13th. And then before we get too deep into this, I want to also mention a couple of books if anybody is really interested in these subjects. This is the Geology of the Ice Age Trail by Dave Michelson. If you like this talk, I recommend this book. Similarly, from a history standpoint, or a history of science, history of geology, this book, Ice Finders, How a Poet, a Professor, and a Politician Discovered the Ice Age. This changed the way I hike the Ice Age Trail and the way I see things along the Ice Age Trail. So this book really meant a lot to me. And if you like reading about history or the history of science, this is a really fun one too. So let's dig in. One other thing I want to mention is that I have 45 or 42 minutes now to cover 1.8 billion years of history, and I'm sure that I'm not going to mention all of your favorite places along the trail. I'm sure I'm going to offend somebody by not mentioning some of your favorite places, so I apologize for that at the beginning, but quite a bit of ground to cover. Like I said, 1.8 billion years. The oldest bedrock along the Ice Age Trail is about 1.8 billion years old, and that's just as old as the oldest bedrock at Grand Canyon National Park, which gets a whole lot of press regarding its geology, and I think Ice Age Trail can go toe-to-toe with Grand Canyon on that. I think it's really important to point out that the first people arrived in Wisconsin during the Ice Age. It was the latter part of the Ice Age, but people have been here, living here, since the Ice Age. They are the ancestors of today's Menominee, Ho-Chunk, and others, and they have lived here for 13,000 or so years. And the modern history of today's Ice Age Trail begins with the Isaac Walton League in the 1920s, and let's get started with that. Partnership. This trail has been a partnership since the very beginning. 1926, the Isaac Walton League purchased about 800 acres around Moon Lake near Dundee. Over the next 10 years, it was volunteers who were constructing hiking trails there at what they called the Moon Lake Preserve. And then 10 years later, after the property was acquired, that nonprofit partner donated that property to the state of Wisconsin to be the very first property for the Kettle Moraine State Forest. So that partnership, volunteers building the trail, volunteer nonprofit organization buying land, DNR acquiring land, that's baked right in from the beginning of this trail. And then as the state gradually acquired land since the 1930s, create the Kettle Moraine State Forest, it was volunteers who'd been there all along building this trail that we all love. 6 years later, after that nonprofit partner, the Isaac Walton League, donated that 800 acres to the state, they produced this report. And it was about a 10-page report, 1942. I've only pulled out two of the main highlights from that report. One was the nonprofit partner was saying that the two units, the northern unit and the southern unit of the Kettle Moraine, should be connected, that the state should be buying the land along the entire 100-mile corridor. They were saying that back as early as 1942. Other highlight is there that they're saying that there should be a trail for hikers and skiers, and they had a different name for it at that time. It should be called the Wisconsin Glacier Trail. These are kind of the beginnings of the Ice Age Trail. And they say in 1942, a hiker with a blanket or a sleeping bag could then hike 100 miles along this trail and yet always be in the wilderness. Sounds kind of familiar to things we talk about with Ice Age Trail, 100 miles times 10. And not surprisingly, the chairperson of this committee who prepared this report was Ray Zillmer. I'm sometimes asked, what's the original segment of the Ice Age Trail? And there's different ways to answer that, because what we call a segment now, they didn't really think of that segments. Oh, let's make the first segment of the Ice Age Trail. They didn't even think of it as a segment. It was the Kettle Moraine Glacial Trail, complete with a misspelling of the word moraine, and it was 18 miles long. That's the first 18 miles of the Ice Age Trail from Mothy Lake, all in the northern Kettle Moraine, north to a silo by Greenbush Kettle. Is the silo still there?
There is. The kettle's still there.
The kettle is still there, that's right. Greenbush Kettle, and much of the route remains as was, when I found this map, I found it without a date on it. So it's somewhere between late 40s, 1950s, maybe 1960 at the latest. So much of the trail remains the same as it was then, but around Greenbush Kettle, I know it's one of the places where there was a reroute at one point near the shelter there. And then in 1958, Ray Zillmer he lost his patience with the state of Wisconsin, with the DNR. I still hear that today, people not patient with the DNR. That's what we have to be, please. We ask for your patience. Ray Zillmer founded two organizations, the Ice Age Park and Trail Foundation, which became the Ice Age Trail Alliance. He also founded an organization called the Ice Age National Park Citizens Committee. And that second organization was basically, he was at the helm of both. And Ice Age Trail Alliance, the Ice Age Park and Trail Foundation, one arm, and then the Ice Age National Park Citizens Committee was like the lobbying arm. And so for tax purposes, for the IRS, he kept them as two separate organizations, and he was at the helm of them both. Generated a whole lot of press. Ray Zillmer knew a lot of people, he was well connected. And this was Milwaukee Magazine in 1961, just a couple of months after Ray Zillmer passed away. Asked the question, a national park in Wisconsin? Again, it's about a 10-page or 9-page paper. You can see the map there in the middle. Last year's screen was low enough where I could reach. I know I'm tall, but I'm not that tall. But that gray line there, you'll recognize that. That's roughly the route of today's Ice Age Trail. And incidentally, one of the other board members of the original Ice Age Trail Alliance, he was publisher of this magazine, Let's Go Milwaukee. And so Ray Zillmer knew how to pick them. Also, around that time, as a result of the 1958 work, the National Park Service got involved because there were bills introduced in Congress to create an Ice Age National Park, or a Wisconsin Glacier National Park, or a Moraine National Park. Bills were actually introduced in Congress, and so the National Park Service said, we better send some staff out there to look at this idea and study it. This is one of the reports that resulted. National Park Service geologist Robert Rose, spring of 1961, produced this, I keep saying a 10-page, various 10 pages reports. And see the bottom, this is page 1, the bottom paragraph. He outlines several key areas. He says the Kettle Moraine State Forest, the northern unit, the Moraine Driftless Border area near Cross Plains, the Devil's Lake, Baraboo Hills area, and Interstate Park were 4 areas that he considered essential to this new national park that Ray Zillmer had proposed in 1958, and now we're at 1961. And he completed the last paragraph in that report, I think, is one that I look back to and I sometimes use as sort of a yardstick for how we're doing. It's the last text slide that I'll read to you, I think. Nobody likes to begin a presentation where somebody's reading from slides, right? But 1961, this is a National Park Service geologist. He says, "It seems that the National Park Service could not embark on an adventure more important and broader in vision than to enrich the lives of these people and the thousands from elsewhere who will be attracted to this great unit of the National Park System when established, adequately developed, and fully interpreted. This could well rank among the greatest of the many significant adventures upon which the National Park Service has embarked in the past, or with which it may become intimately identified in the future." And I get a little shivers sometimes when I read that. That's essentially what we're trying to do still today, right? Well, the National Park Service, this is 1961, there was no National Trail System Act. There was no model. This was kind of a radical idea for the time. There was no model for a 1,000-mile or even a 500-mile long national park in 1958 or the early 1960s. The National Trail System Act didn't pass until 1968. So Robert Rose seemed to be on board with this idea, but the National Park Service said, it's too hard to administer that thing. How would we administer something like that? And the DNR said, we don't want to give up any DNR land to the National Park Service because they're going to close it to hunting. And so Ray Zillmer had passed away, and so what they came up with was the Ice Age National Scientific Reserve. That legislation passed Congress in 1964. And that's the last I'm going to say about the National Scientific Reserve, because that could spend a whole lot of time just talking about that. That's a subject for another day, maybe next year. A few years later, in the early 1970s, not a lot more had happened with this Ice Age Trail thing. And so the Ice Age Park and Trail Foundation helped create the Ice Age Trail Council. That was a separate organization, and it is from the council that we now have chapters. That's where the whole idea of chapters, volunteer chapters along the trail, came from, was with the beginning of the Ice Age Trail Council in the 1970s. The Ice Age Trail Council merged with the Ice Age Park and Trail Foundation in 1990 into a single organization. Back to 1976, the first book about the trail was published. Henry Rice, Congressman Henry Rice, was the lead author on that book. A few years later, July 1980, the DNR and the Ice Age Trail Alliance signed their first MOU, where the DNR and the Ice Age Park and Trail Foundation began a formal relationship working together on the trail. A few months later, Congress designates the Ice Age Trail a National Scenic Trail, and then 7 years later, the state legislature designates the Ice Age Trail a state scenic trail. So Ice Age Trail has this dual designation of being both a national scenic trail and a state scenic trail. You're probably all familiar with that map. That's from the National Park Service brochure about the trail. The red line shows the current, roughly, the trail route. And you'll see this map a few more times during the presentation. I'll have some areas highlighted in yellow that'll point to where I'm talking about and some of these slides coming up. So we're going to highlight some of the key features coming up here. So the Ice Age Trail connects many nationally significant resources. We can talk about some of the nationally significant history along the Ice Age Trail, and that would be embodied in the effigy mounds that you can find along the trail. The boyhood home of John Muir is certainly a nationally significant place. All the Leopold Shack is along the Ice Age Trail. Civilian Conservation Corps sites from the Depression, and the Underground Railroad, those just to name a few of the nationally significant historical resources along this trail. We also have nationally significant ecological resources along the trail. Habitat for the Carter blue butterfly in the central sands part of the state. And the rusty patch bumblebee, another federally endangered resource. And then some globally rare resources oak barrens and oak savanna along the trail in different areas. Those are very rare resources, nationally significant, and then of course prairie, also nationally significant resources. And then geology. We have, of course, some nationally significant geology along the Ice Age Trail. I have two slides like this, and I'd like you to try to take two things from this slide and the next one. First of all, imagine the vastness of that huge continental glacier. 2 miles thick. It's the blue area centered on Hudson Bay. 2 miles thick the ice was. 2,000 miles across. Imagine what the weight of that would do to the landscape. And as it's expanding, what it's doing to the landscape underneath, and how it's changing the climate as it was growing, and then eventually as it wasted back, the effect that might have on climate. It was enormous. It's really, really hard to imagine something that big. It's like an ocean of ice. And you can go to Glacier National Park or to Alaska and see glaciers today. Those are mere rivers of ice. I think I learned that analogy from this book. Alpine glaciers are like rivers of ice. The continental glaciers were like oceans of ice. They were enormous. The closest thing we have today to that is in Antarctica. The other thing to take from this in the next slide is that geologists name periods of Earth history for the places that tell the stories or represent what was happening during those periods, during those geologic periods of Earth. Think of most of us probably heard of the Cambrian time period. Cambrian's named for the Cambrian Mountains in Great Britain. Geologists name a period of Earth history the Wisconsin glaciation. That's not just the name of a place, that's the name of a period of time. And they've named it after Wisconsin because what you can find here is really special, it's unique. So let's look at that next slide. If I can get it to come up, there we go. Similar picture, this one shows definitely the late Wisconsin time period and early Holocene. And this is when people arrived, this period arrived in Wisconsin. And you can see the red areas are moraines. Here's Wisconsin, right up in here. And we know that people were along the west coast as early as 14,000 years ago, maybe earlier. I just read in Georgia a site, maybe 17,000 years ago there were people. You know, right over here in Kenosha County, there's a site that's been dated to 12,500 years. So we know there were people in here during that period of time. And they've been here ever since. People have been here ever since. But look at the vastness of that. It's enormous. All right. Let's talk a little bit specific Ice Age Trail. We'll go feature by feature through some of the main ones that we hear about, some of the geology terms that can be hard to keep track of. End moraines and terminal moraines. Terminal moraine is a term that some geologists don't use anymore, but we often say that the Ice Age Trail follows the route of the terminal moraine across Wisconsin. Some geologists don't use the term terminal moraine anymore. You can think of the terminal moraine as the outermost edge of the end moraine. And so these red lines, at least from Rock County over to the west, if that's the end moraine zone, the terminal moraine is like right out on the outer west edge or southern edge if you're farther north of the end moraine zone. And there are classic textbook versions out there of terminal moraine, and I'll show you a picture of one. And then there's places where it's, there's not really a terminal moraine, we're kind of in the end moraine zone here. But Ice Age Trail, this is a true statement, does follow the terminal moraine for much of its route, but there are surprisingly few places where the trail is actually right on the terminal moraine. You all know where that place is? West Bluff. Right. West Bluff of Devil's Lake, just off the Ice Age Trail in the driftless area, looking north to the north shore. And there's a little hill there, and that's terminal moraine. Just beyond the chalet there along the lakeshore. That is a nationally significant moraine if there ever was one, because of the way it wraps around the Baraboo Hills, and then it's on the south side of Devil's Lake. There's also a terminal moraine that basically plugged an ancient valley And now there's a lake in the middle of that valley with terminal moraines on both sides. It's, as far as we know, unique in North America, perhaps unique in the world. So, and that's a place where the Ice Age Trail is, right out on the terminal moraine. It's right there behind the chalet at Devil's Lake on the North Shore. And then this one's my favorite. This is the Highland Lake segment of the Ice Age Trail in Langlade County. That is just textbook. I mean, that, and if you can read the contour map, over here, these lines are lines of consistent elevation above sea level. And so out here is outwash plain, and then this rises up to the terminal moraine, kind of goes diagonally across the screen, and then behind it is end moraine. If ever there was a place that really showed what a glacier can do to a landscape, boom, there it is. Glacial lobes, we hear about that a lot. The Green Bay lobe, the Chippewa lobe, the Wisconsin Valley lobe, we hear about those a lot. So, I used the analogy ocean of ice before. So just like oceans along their edge have harbors and bays along the edge of the ocean, continental glaciers have lobes. And they are determined by the underlying topography. And so Lake Superior had an enormous impact on how the glaciers affected Wisconsin, because Lake Superior is, of course, the deepest place in North America. It's the deepest place, the lowest elevation in North America is not Death Valley, California. It's the bottom of Lake Superior, just north of Wisconsin. And so the glaciers, as they were expanding out of Hudson Bay in Canada and coming south, as they hit Lake Superior coming south, they were diverted. And that's why Wisconsin, it's that sort of big dent in what the areas that were covered by glaciers. So anyway, we have these lobes, and they're kind of famous in Wisconsin because we have these, they're so well developed in places that we have these interlobate areas between them, like between the Green Bay lobe and the Lake Michigan lobe, that gray area. That is an interlobate area. We call it the kettle moraine. Geologists don't use the term kettle moraine as a geologic term anymore. Kettle moraine is more of a proper noun today. But that's that area. And another interlobate moraine feature, or interlobate feature, is Timms Hill, Wisconsin's highest point. That's between the Chippewa lobe and Wisconsin Valley lobe. That was also part of a interlobate area. And back to a previous slide where I mentioned that the terminal moraine forms a lot of the route of the Ice Age Trail, with the western 2/3 of the trail generally follow the terminal moraine. The eastern 1/3 roughly follows the kettle moraine or the interlobate area. That's this yellow highlighted area. Kettle moraine's kind of famous because, speaking of lobes, the Wisconsin kettle moraine is the place that geologists figured out that continental glaciers had lobes. It's because the kettle moraine is such a distinct, conspicuous feature that geologists were able to figure out that continental glaciers had lobes. And anybody who's hiked in the kettle moraine will recognize that. I mean, you could pick that out, right? I didn't have to tell you that's kettle moraine, for those of you who know the kettle moraine. Hummocky topography, up and down, kettles, ponds, ridges, and then that material, this material here. Pebbles, cobbles, all rounded to some extent. And a lot of them are that whitish or light color gray, light gray to white. Niagara dolomite is the bedrock nearby, and so we'll talk about that in a little bit too. Next feature, moulin cames. They're formed when meltwater on top of a glacier carries soil and rocks that fall into vertical shafts in the glacier, leaving conically shaped hills, like Hershey's Kisses. And the cames along the Ice Age Trail and the kettle moraine, and I've heard Dave Michelson, it might even be in this book, where he refers to the cames in the kettle moraine, the moulin cames in the kettle moraine, as some of the finest moulin cames in the world, and that he's brought geologists there to see them. There are cames in other areas of Wisconsin, but not moulin cames, this special kind of came that was formed the way described there. So I'm going to highlight a few of them in these yellow areas. The northern kettle moraine, and then Polk Cames near Slinger. Those are fantastic. And then Holy Hill, of course. Those hills are cames also, Moline Cames. Another contour map, and this is the contour map of the Polk Cames. You can see the Ice Age Trail and sort of a red dashed line weaving through there. And those, for a glacial geologist, again, I'm not a glacial geologist, but I've heard glacial geologists say that that's just really fantastic. And then a picture from the early 1960s of one of the Moline Cames in the northern kettle moraine when it was still in pasture. And so you didn't have so many trees, and you could really see the underlying glacial landform. That's partly why late fall, winter, early spring is such a great time to go out around the state and look at the landforms. You can see the landforms without the leaves on. I like leaves, but if you want to see the landforms, something to be said for that. And then the last Moline Came picture, this one is from 1980 when the visitor center at the Northern Kettle Moraine had just been completed. You know, the fresh asphalt and the grass isn't even growing yet, but looming off in the distance there is Dundee Came. I think it's just an iconic photo along Ice Age Trail. Let's talk a little bit about eskers. Eskers are long, winding ridges of stream sediment deposited in tunnels beneath the ice, basically rivers flowing under the glacier. Dozens of eskers are along the Ice Age Trail. I'm just going to highlight a few, again in yellow on this map. Near Mishicot, there's still a really nice esker over by Point Beach State Forest label there on the east. That one has been quarried quite a bit. So there's part of that esker is gone, but it's still there's still some very excellent remnants of that esker. Northern Kettle Moraine, the Parnell esker, we'll see a photo of that in a minute. And then over into the Sheboygan National Forest, there are two eskers that the Ice Age Trail crosses, Mondo esker and Hemlock esker. Each of those eskers are 10 miles long and they're parallel to each other. I think they're spectacular and they should be a national monument. And then over to Red Cedar River, the esker that parallels the Red Cedar River and along the Narrows is another one. And then finally I'll mention the Straight River esker in the far northwest there. And I have a couple pictures. Parnell esker, I think, is probably the most famous esker in Wisconsin. Surprisingly, that esker is, I say, only 2.5 miles long. As eskers go, it's a beautiful esker. It's mostly intact, but it's only 2.5 miles long. And this one is one of the two in the Sheboygan National Forest. Again, these are each about 10 miles long. Hemlock esker and Mondo esker. Let's move on to tunnel channels. Sometimes you have tunnel channels and eskers side by side. Highlighted areas. Tunnel channels are similar to eskers because they formed at the base of a glacier. But tunnel channels formed fast-flowing rivers under the glacier that erode the landscape below the glacier instead of through a tunnel where the debris is deposited at the bottom of the glacier, right? So eskers, the debris is deposited at the base of the glacier in a tunnel. Tunnel channels, the water is moving so fast that it erodes the bed underneath the glacier to form a tunnel. A few of these are in, first one there in yellow in the middle of the state is in Waushara County. There's several in Waushara County, several tunnel channels, like Bone Lake is part of a tunnel channel. A little north of there, near the Hartman Creek sign on Tomorrow River State Trail, that's Highway 10, where Highway 10 goes through. The old Yellowstone Trail goes through there. That valley is a tunnel channel. A little bit north of there in Marathon County, where the trail follows the Mountain Bay Trail for a bit, and Highway 29, that valley is another tunnel channel. Up in the north central part of the map here, right above my finger there, that one is Mondo flowage next to Mondo esker. That's another tunnel channel. And also the Narrows along the Tuscobia Trail, that's part of a glacial tunnel channel. And then finally back to Straight River, the Straight River Tunnel Channel is another significant one.
How long can these be?
Oh, several miles, I'm gonna say, at least several miles. Sometimes they don't look like, sometimes they seem like they're a little undulating in the way they flow. So it can be hard to spot them. It helps to look at them from a map, topographic map. As I mentioned earlier, Bone Lake is part of a tunnel channel. On the south side of the lake, on one of the loop trails, not on the Ice Age Trail, but on one of the loop trails on the south side of the lake, there is an interpretive panel that does a great job of describing this particular tunnel channel. Lakes, we have lots of lakes in Wisconsin, right? And we often don't think of lakes as glacial features, but in most cases, lakes are actually glacial features. And we have about 200 of them along the Ice Age Trail, including this one, Shattuck Lake in the Chippewa Moraine. It's an older photo, so I know in the foreground it's a little different looking now, but we celebrate the lakes, right? And then we don't think about this one as a glacial feature, but you know what? Lake Michigan, even though it's in a pre-glacial valley, it's a glacial feature. It is, and you can think of it as the largest glacial feature along the Ice Age Trail. Not only do we have lakes, we have extinct glacial lakes. We hear a lot about Glacial Lake, Wisconsin in the center part of the state, Adams County, Juneau County, Rocha Cree State Park, that area. Someday we'll have the trail through there. And so that one's probably the most famous one of these glacial lakes that I'm mentioning, but Glacial Lake Oshkosh was in the Fox Valley, covered a much bigger area. And the biggest one of them all, along the Ice Age Trail, I think, is Glacial Lake Scuppernong. It was vast. It was most of Jefferson County, over into Waukesha County, northern Walworth County, eastern Dane County. I mean, it was huge in area, but it was only a few feet deep. And then the best named one, right? Bogus Swamp in Langlade County, state natural area. Ice Age Trail follows a road around the edge of it. Quick question?
So they're really the flat areas, the really flat areas are these glacial lakes?
Oftentimes, yes. But you can also have till plains, can also be pretty flat, and those might not be extinct glacial lakes. Another thing that we can talk about in Wisconsin that's really hard to talk about in other states because you don't have the landscape, you don't have the landforms to show it. The fact that there wasn't just one continental glaciation in North America, there were multiple, maybe a dozen different glaciations in North America. And we have evidence of that in Wisconsin that you don't find in many other states. So some of the earlier glaciations covered some of these light blue areas, like down here, and then that middle section to the west, and then Minnesota, even though Minnesota says that they have some driftless area, I mean, by Wisconsin definition of driftless area, Minnesota does not have any driftless area. It was just glaciated so long ago, it's a lot harder to find that evidence of glaciation. And again, we have this driftless area here because of Lake Superior, because Lake Superior was so deep that the ice was channeled away in both two directions away from Wisconsin, and it took a lot for that ice to sort of climb out of the Lake Superior Basin and cover more of these areas, but never quite covered the Wisconsin driftless area. But anyway, we have this evidence of multiple glaciations along the Ice Age Trail, and these three areas highlighted in yellow are some places that are right along the Ice Age Trail where you can see the evidence of that. And I have a picture from one of those places. This is the Montrose-Syada State Ice Age Trail area in southern Dane County. And you look at that in the foreground, you'd say, gosh, that really does look like it was glaciated. And if you walked along the edge of this agricultural field, you'd find erratic rounded boulders that were rounded by the glacier in piles that 100 and some years ago, farmers moved those rounded boulders off the side. So it was glaciated, but then there's that ridge there along the top, and there's exposed sandstone along the top there in that ridge. And so you think, well, was it glaciated? Wasn't it glaciated? Well, it was just so long ago that it's a little bit harder to tell. And we have a few places along the Ice Age Trail that show that. And then, as I mentioned, of course, we have the driftless area. And the driftless area is completely surrounded by glaciated landscapes, but at no time was the driftless area completely surrounded at once by ice, because we had these multiple glaciations. So at some times, the glaciers came down the Lake Michigan Basin. Aren't you guys going to be echoing me along the way here? Covered into Wisconsin and all the way down to Illinois. And then at other times, came down from the west this way, but at no point was the driftless area covered during the Pleistocene or Pliocene glaciations. Unfortunately, we have a few places in Dane, Sauk, perhaps Juneau County, depending on what the route becomes, where we can see places in the driftless area. And to me, it's important because it helps illustrate, you have 1,000 miles or so of glaciated landscape, and then you go to these places in the driftless area and you go, oh, wow, that's really different. Again, it's back to this book. This helped me see things differently and how special that contrast really is between glaciated and unglaciated. If glaciers had been through that spot, I think a glacier would have toppled that rock. And so when you go to places and you see stacks of rock, not the little stacks that people pile up, the big ones like this that weigh many, many tons, a glacier would have still knocked that over. So those are clues to an unglaciated landscape. So that's a summary of some of the main glacial features that you find along the Ice Age Trail. And of course, there are many others. Ice-walled lake plains, many of us we've heard about. I just mentioned till plains, parallel ice marginal ridges, ice wedge polygons. I was talking to somebody earlier about kettle marginal ridges. And there's so many other glacial features you can find along the Ice Age Trail. And so we've got not just some of the best individual glacial features you can find in the United States or North America and Wisconsin. We also have this breadth of so many different kinds of glacial features, and I only have 45 minutes and I'm already running out of time. I want to talk a little bit about some of the bedrock geology really quickly, because this is what gets us back deep into time, Earth history. Some people think, well, the Ice Age Trail is just a glaciated landscape. That's all within the last couple million years, maybe in the last 100,000 years. But actually, the Ice Age Trail, you pass exposed bedrock in some places that goes far back into Earth history. I want to mention a few of them: the Niagara Dolomite, volcanic basalts, quartzites in the Blue Hills and Baraboo Hills are 1.6 billion years old, and then the Paleoproterozoic rocks, it's a really hard word to say, that we have in a couple of other places. And again, these two provide contrast to the glaciated landscape, and this too was something that this book really gave me an appreciation for. So let me
What is that?
What's that?
What book is that you keep showing?
Sure, I mentioned at the beginning, Ice Finders, how a poet, a professor, and a politician discovered the Ice Age. I'll leave it out here, you can take a look at it. Take a picture of the cover at the end. The Niagara Escarpment, this red arc across eastern Wisconsin, actually goes down into Illinois, but it's exposed very well in Wisconsin through the UP, arcs around. The Bruce Trail in Canada follows the Niagara Escarpment, and then it's named, of course, for Niagara Falls, which is right about there. And then the Niagara Escarpment goes a little bit into upstate New York, too. About 400 million years old. That sounds pretty old. In some places, that could be as old a rock as you'll find. But as you see, we have much older rocks in Wisconsin. We saw some of that Niagara Dolomite in the Kettle Moraine, and those cobbles, those pictures of those rounded rocks in the Kettle Moraine, that's Niagara Dolomite from the Niagara Escarpment. This is near the eastern terminus of the Ice Age Trail at Potawatomi State Park. Now let's move back in time. I'm going to skip over the 500 million year old Cambrian rock that we have in some places along the trail. Back twice as far into Earth history, 1.1 billion years old. This is from the mid-continent rift zone, some volcanic rocks that we have. Only place along the Ice Age Trail you find these is in Polk County, on the western part of the trail. And this outcrop, some of you might notice or recognize this. This is just northwest of Straight Lake, 1.1 billion years old. And that rock there is as old as the oldest rock along the Appalachian Trail. But we have much older rock yet along the Ice Age Trail. I love these bragging rights with Grand Canyon and the Appalachian Trail. Come on, bring them on. I skipped over a little bit over the Blue Hills and the Baraboo Hills where the rock is 1.6 billion because the oldest rock on the Ice Age Trail is at Grandfather Falls and Dells of the Eau Claire. And that rock is 1.8 billion years old. And that's a picture of Grandfather Falls. That rock has witnessed 40% of Earth history. So to summarize, the Ice Age Trail has areas of very old bedrock. Older than anything along the Appalachian Trail, and just as old as anything along the base of Grand Canyon National Park. But most of the Ice Age Trail, as we know, passes through areas sculpted by continental glaciers during the Ice Age. Also during the Ice Age, the first people arrived here. And they were the ancestors of today's Ho-Chunk, Menominee, and others. For over 10,000 years, they took really good care of the landforms that the Isaac Baldwin League began to protect in the 1920s. With Ray Zillmer really at the lead. And then the next generation after Ray Zillmer, some of them are in this photo. In the center here is Congressman Henry Royce, center of attention, in a great looking suit. And then some others who were really prominent in that era. Norm Booth is two back from Henry Royce. Immediately behind Henry Royce in the blue t-shirt is Jim Stocker, the person who thru-hiked the Ice Age Trail. There's Adam Cahow, third from the left, just passed away in the past year. And Joe Jopek, farthest on the left. And John Zillmer, son of Ray Zillmer, is over here in the pink shirt. And Ken Lange, who was the naturalist at Devil's Lake, has his back to us in the DNR shirt. And they were at the grand opening of an Ice Age Trail segment at Devil's Lake in 1979. Today we stand not only on the shoulders of all of the generation of them and all of the generations of people who came before us. On our shoulders, on all of our shoulders, is the future of the Ice Age Trail. Thank you. I have to do this again in 12 minutes. I'll take one question, and then please, if you have other questions, look for me this evening. I'll be around this evening and tomorrow morning. One question.
Yeah, you showed the glacier going all the way down to mid-Illinois and mid-Ohio. Are the glacier features down in those states as prominent or as important down there as it is in Wisconsin?
They have some fine terminal moraines and moraines areas. They don't have some of the features that we have. They don't have some of the, certainly the drumlins that we have. I didn't talk about drumlins because they're pretty rare on the trail. They don't have some of the breadth of features that we have on the Ice Age Trail. And that's partly why geologists named that period of Earth history the Wisconsin glaciation, because they're just so prominent here. And they are, many of them are harder to find elsewhere. Good question. Thank you. Thank you.